Live Online. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast, and here to welcome you to our edition of Broadband Breakfast Live Online, talking about AI. Before we get to our great guests, who we're really excited to have, I just want to say a word or two about Broadband Breakfast, what we are, and why we care about topics, including even AI. We talk about better broadband, better lives. That's kind of become our tagline. I've probably mentioned it on every one of these broadcasts we do every Wednesday at 12 noon. And to us, that means higher capacity internet everywhere in the country, and I guess by extension, the world, although we are, US focused. And from that better infrastructure, better capacity, we then think about the implications, the impact, we call it. Broadband's impact is our tag for that. And it's basics of how broadband impacts our world, our society, telehealth, teleeducation, the inclusion in society and the world that comes from having high capacity broadband. But we also are focused on big tech. And, quite frankly, we wouldn't have social media if it were not for broadband, right? I mean, Facebook, now Meta, is pretty much an app that rode the 4G, and now we're on to 5G craze. And so we really deeply care about the impact that our broadband connected world brings. And this is certainly one topic that we want to be focused on. Now, we're the first to admit we're not experts in every topic, and certainly not AI. And that's why we have people like our guests here with us. But I wanted to just share that view of the world that we at Broadband Breakfast have as a context for why we want to talk about topics like this. And this is one of the key things we do. We are a news publisher. We publish stories every business day on Broadband Breakfast. We hope you will join the site, subscribe, and come to these as you all are. We stream this not just to this audience on Zoom, but to Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. And we're really pleased with the continued regularity of you, the audience. We've also started up, we call it Broadband Breakfast for Lunch. Okay, that is an event that we do on the second Wednesday of each month. So in addition to a live stream, it's both a hybrid and in-person event. We will be in person. And so just to give a quick outline of our upcoming events, we will be talking next Wednesday, Groundhog Day, about broadband mapping. We'll be talking on February 9th. That's our in-person Broadband Breakfast for Lunch event on cryptocurrency. And we will be talking on February 16th with state broadband officials. And all of these are visible on our page for our collecting page. I'm going to send it through the chat window for those of you who are on the Zoom call, but it is available, clearly on the top of Broadband Breakfast. So we hope you will, visit that page often. We update it. We change it sometimes. We have breaking events. And so we appreciate, those of you who come and attend these events every week. The other thing I just wanted to say is give a shout out to our sponsors. We wouldn't be able to do this event or other events without the support of Utopia Fiber, Lit Communities, Broadband.money, Broadband Now, Powerhouse Management, Lightbox, Samsung, Render Networks, and Positron Access, and the California Emerging Technology Fund. If you have any interest in learning more about sponsorship, there's another spot across the top of our Broadband Breakfast banner that you can access. Be happy to talk more about that with each of you. Without much further ado, I want to turn it over to our guests today. Today, we're talking with I'm going to go ahead and introduce them into the view so everyone will be able to see them. We are here today with Chloe Autio. Have I said that right? I hope I haven't put that name terribly. Chloe, we're really excited to have you. She is an advisor and senior manager at the Cantalis Group, a consultancy that focuses on strategy and governance for AI. Chloe was a director of public policy at Intel, of course, huge tech giant, behind the scenes power of so many technologies, and is also a founding board member of the DC chapter of Women in Security and Privacy. That's a WISP, and holds an economics degree from Berkeley. My second guest is Sarah O. Sarah is a senior fellow at the Technology Policy Institute and has presented research to Western Economics Association, Telecommunications Policy Research, Commerce, as well as testimony to the Senate Commerce Committee, and has co-authored work published by the Northwestern Journal of Technology and Intellectual Property. I have to highlight that one because that was a piece that Sarah, I, and Thomas Hazlett, our co-author, wrote together. So Sarah, it's great to see you again and to have you here with us talking about the economics, the technology, and the on-the-ground realities of artificial intelligence. So thank you for joining us. Let's turn it over to you, Chloe. Tell us a little bit about how you see the landscape of AI at this moment right now.
Sure, and thanks, Drew. It's really exciting to be here with all of you this morning, or I guess it's this afternoon if you're on the East Coast. So yeah, I think to talk about my perspectives on the topic, Drew mentioned a bit about my background. I spent 4 years at Intel within the public policy group there, really focused on emerging public policy, regulation on artificial intelligence, but also working really closely, with the business and our customers, or Intel's customers at the time in the industry. And I think the one thing that I would add to this discussion, or most want to highlight, is that I think that for AI, even though it seems sort of like this off in the distance, emerging technology, we're no longer in like the hype cycle or the emerging space with AI. And I think the biggest indicator of this, aside from a couple of examples of how the technology is now integrated into daily life, that I'll mention later or talk about a bit later, is the fact that not just governments, but also organizations across industries are now focused on overseeing and governing this technology instead of just investing in it and focusing on R&D and making sure that we're competitive in AI. Obviously, AI competition is a really important issue, and making this technology as efficient and productive and great as it can be is something that I think business and policymakers alike will always focus on. But I think it's really interesting and something that we should all be thinking about and paying attention to, that, a lot of conversations around AI, not just in the policy space, but also within industry, are centered now around, responsible AI, ethical AI, governance and oversight. And a couple of examples of that work, the Department of Defense has released principles. Various individual companies have principles or policies around AI ethics and governance. And just today, actually, the Business Roundtable, which is a trade organization of the largest companies based in the U.S., put out a roadmap for responsible AI practices. So it's just really interesting to see sort of how the dialogue around AI as this hype technology that we must invest in and promote research in has kind of shifted to, hey, there are some concerns and issues with AI. How do we address those and how do we think about them? So I'm really excited to sort of talk about that trend today, and particularly, what's happening in the regulatory space, because I think it's just really interesting and exciting to see what's happening. So I'll stop there. Pretty short intro, and looking forward to hear from you, Sarah. Yeah, well, go ahead, Drew.
Let me actually ask a question or two of you to kind of flesh out some aspects of the landscape, Chloe.
Sure.
Well, obviously, kind of AI is maybe a little past the hype cycle, right? We moved from AI to 5G to, I don't know, NFTs. Anyway, we're on to different hyped technologies. Like, what in your minds were the key drivers of the hype cycle, right? Or of the reality of it lagging a couple of years? Like, what in your mind are the things that have pushed AI into this position you have of no longer being in the cycle of just pure investing, but also into overseeing governance and so forth?
Yeah, so I would say a couple of things. I mean, I think from a technology standpoint, right, it's the compute, right, the power and the processing. Advancements in AI processing at the hardware level have just exploded over the last couple of years. There's a really nascent startup market, for GPUs and CPUs, natural language processing, or neural network processing chips, right, that are all focused on AI. So I think the compute and the hardware is a really big driver for the technology. Second, obviously, is the data. I mean, the amount of data, AI runs on data, and I'm sure most people have sort of heard that concept before, but AI is a technology that learns off of patterns in data and needs that data to make predictions or make decisions about certain things. It's all informed by data. And the amount of data that, technology is able to collect about us, whether that is static or, in a more responsive way, is just, it's crazy. I'm sure that's no secret to anyone. So those two sort of components or elements, I think, have really helped fuel advancements in AI as a technology. In terms of the shift to governance and oversight, I think that's really been in, because of some incidents or, examples of AI either being misused or, situations in sort of the development and design phase of the AI creation process where people haven't made considerations or about things like bias, discrimination. AI has, biased results when it comes to applications like facial recognition, which are really high risk and, create implications for people's civil liberties or freedoms, opportunities like whether they can get benefits from the government or, can apply and be fairly considered for a job. So these examples, I think, just sort of coming into mainstream proliferation are a big part of why the discussion also has shifted to thinking about like what can we do, to prevent some of these things from happening and make AI a more fair technology for everyone to access and use.
Well, wonderful. I mean, I think that's those 2 points about the compute power and the privacy issues. I mean, I think in terms of like an actual live implementation of technologies, it's like voice recognition into the mainstream over the last 5-8 years, facial recognition, right? I mean, and all of the questions raised by the use of facial recognition technologies in China as well as globally, and then autonomous vehicles, which is maybe another one in that hype cycle, right? I mean, we see how cool it is to have a self-driving car, but how are we going to get there? And then there's all those questions about how the car reacts in situations of peril. So anything else you would just add on kind of like those apps that have kind of driven a consciousness of AI, Chloe?
Yeah, and one thing I want to actually talk about too is that it in some cases, what also makes me feel like we're much moving past the hype cycle of AI is that the ways in which AI I find in which I realize AI is in my life are becoming less and less abrupt, right? So, for example, with a self-driving car, you're like, oh my God, that car has a ton of cameras on it, and obviously I'm in San Francisco because this is where all this stuff is happening. And is there a person in there? Is there not? This is kind of crazy. Or oh, that camera seems to be learning more about me or moving in a way that I'm really weirded out about, or, the robots out of Harvard, MIT, those are sort of the things that people think about and react to, right, abruptly when we're thinking about AI. But one thing that I have noticed lately, and I'm sure other people have too, is that AI sort of is creeping in these much more subtle ways. So for example, if you've done a Google search lately, or not even lately, maybe over the last 6 months, you'll realize that if you ask a question or put in some sort of prompt, the result that you get is a lot more concrete. It used to just be that, the machine would produce a bunch of queries based on a search input or ask, right? But because of machine translation, advances in machine translation, not just, natural language processing to lift, and because of advertising rank different results, you now get this output from Google, search engine of your choice that can actually answer the question or the query that you're looking for in complete sentences and sort of pop up this little white box. I don't know if anyone has seen it, that is pretty clearly like what an answer is pretty directly what you're looking for. And I wasn't really keen on that until someone had pointed out to me. And I thought, gosh, that's an AI advancement that doesn't feel tangible to me. And I did not realize at all that it had changed and advanced at that level. So I think subtle things like this are going to keep happening. And I think, I'm really interested to see how these more subtle advancements in AI can be reconciled, or how we reconcile those with the need for oversight and governance, because I think that's going to be really important.
Well, thank you so much for fleshing that out a little bit more. Chloe, let's turn now to Sarah. Tell us a little bit about how you see the world of AI, artificial intelligence. Obviously, you have a law degree as well as a PhD in economics, and so you have a purview over both those domains. But Sarah, tell us a little bit about your view of this field here.
Thanks, Drew. Today, I'd like to talk about a little bit about trends to watch in 2022 in artificial intelligence. So just this week, there have been a few announcements by prominent AI companies with new developments. So I just wanted to highlight what's happening. Meta, or Facebook, their AI's research supercluster, RSC, is a new supercomputer that they plan to have in operation by the end of the year. And it's going to help that company build entirely new AI systems. So in a press release, or a quotation from one of their, comms people, they say that this computer can power real-time voice translation to a large group of people at the same time, each speaking a different language. So bringing in a little bit of, trends. So the metaverse apparently will include AI technologies that allow people to speak in different languages, understanding each other at the same time. And so you can imagine that would take a lot of compute power to do. And so this supercomputer has 16,000 total GPUs, which is a lot of computers put together. It will be able to train AI systems that have more than 1 trillion parameters and data sets as large as an exabyte. So these are really big data sets full of, video and audio of people speaking, and it'll be training their models that allow for computation of real-time language. So that's incredible. As a point of comparison, Microsoft's AI supercomputer has 10,000 GPUs. So Meta is kind of almost doubling the number of GPUs in one supercluster to 16,000. And if you see pictures in their press release, it's like this big warehouse full of computers. So that's what's happening over at Meta, and that will power the metaverse. And that's not just virtual reality, that's like augmented reality. You can imagine people having conferences and not needing human translation, or having augmented translation. Other trends happening right now, you might have seen a viral Twitter video of like a robot with facial expressions. And so there are other robot faces coming out of Columbia University. There's one called Eva that can have facial expressions. So they're little, muscles in the robotic faces. And those models are learning from video, like how people are speaking, how they're moving their faces with emotion. So I don't know, when I see it, it looks a little bit creepy, but the more and more data that these models ingest, it'll look more realistic. And that's a robot, and that's different from a deep fake video. So there's a whole nother genre of AI that has like video that's artificially made. So faces of Tom Cruise, speaking, or a politician's face speaking. That's a deep fake, and there are companies that are building that. And you can imagine that there would be defensive companies that can filter and identify deep fakes. So that's a national security concern and hazard. And actually the NDAA, the defense bill from last year, included funding for deep fake defense projects. because it is a national security threat if they're fake videos of politicians or whatnot. Other genres of AI trends this coming year. OpenAI is the company that has an AI engine called GPT-3. So people might have heard about GPT-3. It's a update on GPT-2. And this engine can write articles, can draw pictures, can create art. And it's not that, great, but it's pretty good. It can answer questions. The Allen Institute has another AI engine called Macaw, like the parrot, and it can answer questions as well. And it's apparently more efficient than GPT-3 in computing power, and has a different kind of output. And just lastly, I would say to put a note in the foreign policy implications of AI development. So Wu Dao apparently is an engine that's 10 times better than GPT-3 coming out of China. And that has 1.75 trillion variables and inputs into that Chinese AI language model. And so there's evidence which goes into concerns by people like Eric Schmidt, who say that the US really needs to be concerned about competition with China. And he kind of promotes US industrial policy to support AI development in the US, because it's not just, we're not just competing internally among domestic players, but there is a global race to create these AI engines. And so just wanting to, note that developments in AI and folks like Mark Zuckerberg, they're not just looking domestically, he's competing with China and what Alibaba is creating and what other folks are working on. So, and then, I said that was my last point, but there are other developments in AI, like protein folding. So DeepMind is a company in London owned by Google, Alphabet, and they're working on protein folding prediction algorithms, and they reached a really important milestone recently. There's RNA sequencing models that are predicting DNA and RNA sequences. And then I think Chloe mentioned computer vision and self-driving cars. And then, another news item lately, Anduril is a company in defense, and they're using AI to identify drones. And so that's another military application.
So Sarah and Chloe, let me kind of build my own, an informed observer, but not by no means expert on this topic. It's funny. There's a great episode in the HBO series Silicon Valley that is about AI, and it's about like a robot like creature that's been developed by a competitor company, and Big Head, basically asks the robot something, and then to verify the robot's got it right, Big Head tells, "Hey Siri, what's 600,000 times?" It's so funny because it's clear that what's going on is that there's one type of AI, Siri, that's become comfortable and assimilated into our consciousness, and there's another type of AI that looks scary and different, and so we're checking it out against the AI we know. And maybe that's kind of mirrored by Chloe, what you said earlier about like that improved Google search results. That's the very subtle kind of, it's been creeping up on us. And then there's these big advances, like self-driving cars or facial recognition that maybe just seem. So I'm just wondering, would each of you care to comment on like the creeping incrementalism to certain types of AI and the more dramatic steps by some of the things that we've mentioned as milestones? What are your thoughts on that, Chloe and Sarah?
Do you have thoughts, Sarah? You want to go ahead? You can also chat.
Yeah, sure. So creeping incrementalism, I think that's a nice phrase because technology changes over time and we get used to our, technology. So Amazon Alexa can answer questions, and is continually updating its knowledge base, and Siri as well. And so how much of a leap will it be if we have like a Jetsons world? Like, what's the robot's name in that? Like, if we have a robot that has a face that can answer questions with facial expressions, will that, Alexa and Siri are kind of faceless right now. Oh, Rosie. Yes,
Rosie.
thank you. Someone said Rosie. Yeah. So like, maybe there is a Rosie right now, or like, there are devices like the owl camera that does like virtual meetings. So it looks like an owl and it sits on the table and it moves around. So you can imagine, like, as people get more used to applications, it'll be more common. And that's what we're thinking about. Futurism. Like, don't we want developments like the Jetsons? We want like a futuristic world that makes our lives better, like Drew said, but not in a creepy bad way, but in a good way.
Yeah. Drew, I think you're on mute.
I know everyone does that. Creeping, not creepy, right? That's the.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think, Chloe? What do you think about the creeping versus the sudden?
Yeah, I think Sarah made a lot of really good points. One anecdote I'll mention before I maybe share my own thoughts is another relevant news story about Amazon. There's a researcher, I believe she was at Oxford, or maybe Cambridge, in Europe, who requested, like, just this week, all of her data from Amazon. And the amount of information that they had about her, it was like all of a recorded, segment of each time she'd spoken to Alexa, each one of her product choices and receipts at Whole Foods, like what she had bought there, the time that she had spent reading different pages or pieces of information on her Kindle. And so, just a really, truly pervasive amount of data. And I think I would harken back, when I think about this creeping incrementalism, right? I think what I would say, and my personal thoughts on it are is that, these big flashy technologies may be really cool and great and, make us look very competitive and strong and whatever, particularly for defense applications. But I think what people really need to be more careful of and wary of are these more creeping things where, thinking about, people need to think a little bit more, I think, about the direct application of or a link, right, of some of this AI. If General Dynamics or the Boston robotics group that make the robo dogs can build those dogs, I think that's cool and fantastic and really something to marvel at. But it almost attracts a little bit attention from the people who use things like Amazon on the daily and are sort of sharing all of this data in a way that they may not be so aware of, right? I think everyone sort of has this comfort or familiarity with technology that is humanized. And we need to be cognizant that that's very intentional, right? So whether it's a dog or a virtual assistant, it's a design choice by these technology companies most of the time.
Well, let's kind of ask, just if we haven't flatly asked, like, what are the positive and the negative aspects of this collection of machine learning tools that we're talking about now as AI? Like, what's good or what's bad? Like, when you start talking about the robot dog, my mind immediately goes to, oh, wait a second, can terrorists get a robot dog? Can terrorists use Amazon's delivery drones to drop, like I'm sure there are lots of people thinking lots and lots about these questions. Yeah. But from your perspective, Chloe, as a close watcher, expert on AI, how do you think of the plus versus minus of tools like this?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question, Drew. And I think it's something that, everyone, business, policymakers are constantly thinking about, because oftentimes, and probably more often than not, the pluses that you're talking about, the benefits, the productivity, the advancements in efficiency, the accuracy, the very focused optimization can also be the minuses, the negatives, right? Because all of these technologies, most all of them are dual use. So, an application that is trained or created to sort and make predictions based off of data can have a fantastic, result or outcome when it's being used for what I'll call a lower risk situation or circumstance, like helping me pick out what kind of software I want to use for a new thing on my computer, or any product, a couch, because I like looking at blue couches that are leather instead of pink couches that are suede. However, that same ability to track and process and accumulate data about me or someone else could be used in a really terrible fashion or circumstance with a lot more risk, right? Like to make predictions about whether or not someone is high or low risk at reoffending when trying to grant them parole, right?
Right. Your Minority Report, views coming there.
Yes, absolutely. So, I think the best answer to that question, and I would love to hear Sarah's thoughts, are that, every time these technologies are being developed and used, I think that's also why we have such a focus now on governance and responsible use, is because the pluses are the minuses. And no matter, and across situations, across contexts, developers, appliers, customers, users of AI just have to be really aware about what the technology can do and what its limits are, and understand, and think about things that could go wrong in each situation, because people aren't always considering those things.
Sarah, what's your take on the pluses and minuses? How we balance that? How does that enter into kind of regulatory calculations?
Well, I do think AI, like Chloe said, it's and you said too, it's kind of going into every technology and dimension of our lives. So it's like electricity. It's like a general technology. It empowers good and bad uses. So you can imagine when electricity came out and everything starts getting wired and empowered with more battery life and energy, that people would be afraid of positive and negative uses for those machines and empowerments. And so I think the solution is competition. So you don't want just one creator of each technology. So you want several different AI engines that you can choose from that can be compared with each other. You don't just want one. And then you want people who in policy and in industry who are keeping an eye on the technologies and testing them. And it is a scientific process. Like there is concern about algorithmic bias and fairness and responsible AI use. So traditionally for policymakers, the solution to that is transparency and oversight, competition, before you get to regulation, like prescriptive rules and regulations. So, and I think, and also with like the international component too, you don't want to stifle your domestic industry when other countries are pushing forward. But of course, Western values are different from Chinese, communist values. So there's also that influence in how the algorithms are being designed and used. So there is an evolution and an iteration. But I think, with more data and more compute power combined, you're going to have AI, smarter and smarter AI and machine learning algorithms. So how to best direct that development for human good is the question.
Let's pull out two strands of that you just mentioned, Sarah. The first, I want to kind of look at is there something about AI that calls for a new regulatory entity, or is it better to kind of stick with what we have, whether that's the Federal Trade Commission or U.S. Department of Justice antitrust, or quite frankly, I can't think of a lot. So, that may be a sign for that we need some more specialized knowledge, but I'd like both of your opinions on that. And secondly, you just raised the question. It's a very good one to address, which is, what about this type of technology is causing, or is something about this type of technology causing, an exacerbated Cold War with China, right? I mean, we've been hearing a lot about Huawei and telecommunications equipment in U.S. networks. That's been a subject we've addressed directly in many Broadband Breakfast Live Online events. But I'm wondering, just from this perspective of AI and the kind of increased technological competition with China, what what do we do? How do we, like you just said, Sarah, preserve Western democratic values as opposed to, values that are foreign to that?
Yeah, I think for your first question, so specialized knowledge or a new agency, I'm in favor of like going through the courts. So if there is a problem, to see litigation, and so if you see like a civil liberty violation by an AI algorithm, there are laws that a plaintiff can bring suits for, unfair and deceptive advertising, Fair Credit Reporting Act. And so I do think our framework has enough consumer protections that there would be lawsuits. But of course, there needs to be discovery and needs to be evidence. So there are whistleblowers that can raise concerns about AI algorithms. And so I don't think there needs to be a new agency, but I would think that plaintiffs could bring lawsuits, and there would be oversight by congressional committees and concern for maybe there is need for legislation. But I think it's one of those areas where such specialized knowledge might make it hard to create a new agency. So, and then for your second question,
let's let Chloe weigh on that one, then we'll come to the China one. Okay. So Chloe, what do you think about that question? I'm sure you're asked that. What's your standard response, and what do you think about these points?
Yeah, so I think Sarah makes a lot of great points. We are seeing some of that enforcement coming from litigation and in the courts. Currently, I think the approach, particularly that was started under the Trump administration, has been for, different agencies, at least at the federal level, to start making rules about AI regulation for their own jurisdiction. That hasn't really happened at all. And in absence, the Federal Trade Commission, as Sarah mentioned, has come out and said, we are able and we will start enforcing AI violations that are unfair and deceptive under Section 5. But I think it's wonderful that, some of these agencies, in absence of congressional legislation and national privacy law, which is something that the U.S. also desperately needs, where I think some of these AI provisions and issues would come into play. In absence of that, it's great to see, some of these agencies exercising their enforcement authority and power in certain jurisdictions. But, I think with the level of AI adoption that we're seeing and will continue to see, the FTC currently, I don't think even has a lot of staff help, right? I mean, there are wonderful people working there, but just in terms of time and resources to go investigate, do the discovery on privacy violations alone, they're a little bit behind or far behind. And that's, again, why we need this congressional help on privacy. I think the same goes for AI. While there may be the authority, there may not quite be the ability just because of resources and time. And so I do think, that when it comes to AI, there are a lot of provisions, existing law, as Sarah said, that could be applied. It just, I think, is coming to think creatively about how we can make that happen, and how, in the government situation that we're in right now, where, again, resources, time, priorities are so focused, how can we do that? So.
And I know I'm putting off our China question, but Mark Milliman asks a question. Unfortunately, bringing these cases to trial is easier said than done, especially if there's a political component to it. Difficult to find an attorney willing to take a case, and it will require a large retainer. I mean, let's just push in a little bit more on, like, what would a specialized AI oversight agency look like, Chloe? What would I mean, like, obviously we would need some law, or presumably, and that's, some law, and then Congress is weighing in. But like, what would be the factors? What would they be looking at that the FTC is not looking at, for example?
So the factors, like, hold corporations accountable for different kinds or what sort of things that they would do. Yeah. So we've actually seen a couple of proposals in Congress and also just overseas too. The EU AI Act is a pretty prominent, comprehensive, I see Ask AI in here, that's funny, regulatory approach to, regulating AI across the board. And typically the approach in these different proposals is to look at different AI applications and classify them based on whether they are high or low risk. And of course, those standards differ, which is another topic that makes regulating AI, and particularly in a way that is harmonized or coordinated across borders, really difficult because high risk here may be very different than what is high risk in the EU or China or in India. But these high risk categories usually fall along the lines of things that are currently part of U.S. law, right? Like access to opportunity, civil liberties, privacy, though that's not a U.S. Comprehensive U.S. law, respect for human rights, and the things that these agencies and laws are proposing, right, is for sort of some sort of third-party assessment, audit, accountability, metrics, reporting by companies about what they are doing with these AI algorithms or software. And, sometimes these reporting requirements can be pretty robust, like a lot of information. Sometimes it's just simple classifiers. Again, the law or the proposed laws around, what this kind of oversight could look like really, really vary. But I think that if, we had a new agency dedicated to AI oversight, some of the things that they would look at are certainly accountability, transparency, reporting, information about models and what those models are used for each company or each organization working with AI. And I will say, interestingly too, just something to note, the Federal Trade Commission just did start up, I think about 3 months ago, an AI strategy office staffed by a couple of, very well-known AI researchers who have spent time in the private sector and then at a great AI nonprofit that does a lot of research around AI accountability called AI Now. And so I'm, really curious and interested to see what that group will do. But again, for the FTC to have this this power and this might, I think, on AI enforcement, they'll need some more resources and help.
Well, we have a little less than 10 minutes. We're going to end at 10:50 Eastern time today. So I want to dive into the question of international AI with a particular emphasis on China. Let's turn back to Sarah for your thoughts to kick off that piece for us.
Yeah, sure. So I do think that the foreign policy element is interesting, and often it gets siloed into a separate discussion, national security versus like domestic AI development and uses. But it is part of domestic policy to know what's happening with AI around the world. And so I think when there are calls for regulation at home, it's important to also compare regulatory environments here and abroad. So in China, it's like industrial policy. Their government is supporting their AI development. I don't know if it's a good idea for the US to engage in industrial policy to really favor AI companies and do kind of a centralized planning model for industrial policy. But there is an argument, I guess, like Eric Schmidt is saying, that if countries like China are putting their government behind their AI industries, then maybe the U.S. should spend a little bit more on R&D and federal appropriations on AI and defense budget on AI. And so there is a little bit of reaction, like should the U.S. engage in some industrial policy? But in terms of history, China supported Huawei, and then in the U.S. free market, companies like Cisco didn't see benefits in supporting that kind of business, and so then you see an imbalance where industries like semiconductors and routers have gone to China, and we don't have domestic manufacturing. And so there is kind of a balance shifting back with the announcement that Intel is going to be building chips domestically, so that the US is less dependent on Taiwan and supply chains in China. So I do think it's an interesting time to be thinking about supply chains and domestic policy on technology development.
Chloe, what's your take on the China angle on AI, or just even the international? Is the EU going to regulate AI faster than the US? What would that do would that be a boon or a detriment for the United States, for example?
Yeah, so there's a lot of debate about this. The EU AI Act is obviously like the first comprehensive AI proposal that we've seen. Most other AI proposals are aiming that we've seen have looked at regulating a certain sector of AI or a specific application like facial recognition. I think the general sort of debate around the EU approach is that, if the EU wants to take a very strong and forceful approach to regulating AI, it may harm their ability to have a thriving startup economy and an AI startup ecosystem. But I think regardless of whatever side of the debate you fall on, these standards around oversight and regulation and governance are going to keep emerging. I mean, I just put in the chat, even China, through their ministries of standards and technology, which are sort of these, standards setting organizations that work across the country and the government, have looked at creating standards for AI ethics and governance. And so I think that, globally, whether it's through privacy law, which is going to continue to emerge and pass, these, AI bills are just going to keep coming up, and companies are going to have to figure out how to integrate some of these governance practices for transparency, for accountability, for reporting and documentation, regardless. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's great, and I think we for the entire audience, audience on multiple platforms, we will be posting these links as items on this page for this event, so that resources that people can access in the future. We're coming up on our closing time. I want to raise one last issue and invite both of our panelists to address it and also offer any closing thoughts on this topic of AI. We haven't gone maybe into as much of the fields of practice like media and journalism or law and finance and government, but because perhaps it's still a little bit premature for that. But what I'm going to ask now is way premature. And fortunately, we've avoided discussion of the singularity thus far, which is the notion that at some point, given Moore's law, of course, one of the co-founders of Intel, the number of transistors on a chip will double every 24 months. And that seems to have held true for most of 50 years. Maybe it's now just fallen off. But in any case, that's leading to an incredible advance in technology, has for decades. And the notion as formulated in this concept of the singularity is that at some point machines will talk to us and convince us that they're human, right? And so what I want to ask each of you is there some point at which there's a danger beyond all those dangers we've been talking about now, bias and data and coercion in the case of, Chinese Uyghurs. What is your view on whether there's like some existential point at which AI becomes just super dangerous? And of course, I welcome other quick thoughts you have about your views on how AI can be used for good. And let's start with Chloe, and then we'll conclude with Sarah on this question.
Thanks, Drew. Yeah, I'll say really quickly, I think we're pretty far off from the singularity concept, right? Where, AI reaches this level of general intelligence, as we call it, not narrow intelligence, where, the difference between a human machine is virtually non-existent. I think we have a lot of ways to go until then, and that makes me comfortable. What makes me uncomfortable is, or maybe not uncomfortable, but the thing that I want to be more wary of, as in profession and in practice is that, what did you call it? The creeping
incrementalism.
The creeping incrementalism, right, of, AI and other technology. I mean, even in social media, the ways in which social media platforms have changed to optimize for engagement and participation. And it's maybe not, like human versus robot, I can't tell the difference, but just becoming so intertwined with our technologies that it's very hard to pull away. I mean, the metaverse is another great example of this, right? So for me, it's less of this, fear that we'll suddenly all turn into robots or robots will turn into us, but just being really aware of this, the gray space between, where I'm putting my time, my attention, my information, and how that's getting used, and how that technology likes to use me and all of us, right, in a way that is beneficial for it and helps it learn. So that gray space again is what gives me a little bit of pause. But again, it's a crazy world out there, and I'm interested to see, of course, how AI continues to evolve.
Sarah, quick final thoughts that you have.
Yeah, I think singularity was a buzzword like 10 years ago, when people were really concerned. They're about, or not concerned, but looking forward to so much data and compute power. And I think 10 years later, we're talking about metaverse and how things are going more into virtual reality and augmented reality. But if you think about it, there's a lot of physical reality that hasn't been digitized yet. And so I think we're heading there, but we're not quite there yet. So we'll need Rosie in our house. We'll have that before I think we're all uploaded to a metaverse. But who knows how quickly it'll all accelerate.
Well, that will have to be our last word. Thank you for our sponsors participating and supporting our Broadband Breakfast Live Online events. Thank you to each of you for being with us. And most importantly, thank you to our guests for today, Chloe Altio and Sarah O. It's been great to be with you. And until next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern, I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. Take care, everybody.